Welcome to another episode of Rugby Lives Here. Hope everyone is enjoying your Thursday evening, and we like to bring big hitters on this particular show, and we have, if not the biggest so far on this particular episode, we have a former All Black and now the Singapore national team head coach for the men's, the women's, the under-19s. We have none other than Simon Mannix in the house. Simon, thank you so much for joining us. And you know, it's a crazy time that we're living in with COVID-19.
Sure.
How have you managed to deal with this whole situation in Singapore away from home?
Firstly, it's great to be here and to get the opportunity to talk about Singapore Rugby because during this period it's been inexistent, and sadly for a lot of sports it's been a really trying period for everybody. We're not back on our feet yet, which is, we're all hopeful that the changes we can make, that we can all get back out on the field and enjoy training and playing the game that we love so much. But it's been challenging, without a doubt, and I think everybody has their stories to tell. But on the other side of it, only having arrived in Singapore probably 10 or 11 months ago, it's I could probably think of no other place better in the world to actually experience what we've been going through. And I think it's been tremendous to watch how the government and how all the locals have dealt with things, and the discipline is certainly something which I've taken away from this period, and have a lot of admiration for the Singaporeans on how they've dealt it and gone on, tried to get on with their business as usual. Having lived in Europe for a long time, it's and in France, it's sure, and my wife is French, so she won't mind me for saying it, but the French levels of discipline are nowhere near what we've seen here. So it's been, while it's a challenging period for everybody, I think we've got to try and remain positive.
You've had a great playing career. You've also coached in France. So how did you get wind of interest of Singapore Rugby Union and then eventually chose to call Singapore your home in 2020?
Yeah, it was a discussion I'd actually had with the chief executive of the Hong Kong Rugby Union. I was travelling through Hong Kong. I was on my way back from the Southern Hemisphere, and Hong Kong was often my port of stop on the way back. And I had been coaching up in Europe professionally since 2006. So it was 13 years at the top end of the game in the clubs up in Europe, and had time to take away. I had time out of the game after losing my job in the club in the top 14 in Po, and that time of reflection allowed me to think about possibly change of lifestyle, change of challenge. And so I was travelling, came down on a fact-finding trip about Asian rugby. I spent time in Japan, spent time in Hong Kong, and as well had a brief meeting here in Singapore on the way through, where I met Daniel Mark just to find out about what the role was all about. And then spent time in Japan, and then the possibility came up to interview for the job here, and I thought, why not? It was a step into what I thought Asian rugby was going to be, really on the point of wanting to take off post-World Cup. And I thought that, I was interested in Japan, obviously, in the club rugby, professional rugby scene up there. But the desire and the want to try and move things and get a shift into professionalism from the people I spoke to at the Singapore Rugby Union sort of appealed to me as well. And it's a completely different challenge to what I'm used to. My usual rugby year would involve 32 games minimum, and that would be review, preview every single week, and then you'd have 4 weeks off, and then you'd go again. So it was non-stop, whereas this role was going to be about not a lot of contact with the players, not so many games at all, and to this point I'm on 0 games. So it was going to be challenging, but it was I thought it'd be something that I could really enjoy, and coupled to that, having a young family, it was an opportunity for them to experience life outside of France as well.
So there was no temptation to go back. I know you were part of that short list of 26 coaches who were invited to apply for that vacant All Blacks head coach spots. Were you ever close?
Not at all. No, it wasn't even. That's just a lot of media speculation, and Not that I want to rubbish the work that people do in the media, but no, there was no New Zealand. I made my decision to leave New Zealand in '96 as a player, and I'm not really overly, I'm in no rush to get back there. I've loved my time up in Europe, and and for the nearly 1 year here in Asia, it's been interesting. It's been challenging, but it's we're really enjoying our time here. From the lifestyle viewpoint, I would just love to get out and do it as I do, and getting things organised on the rugby side of it, because I maintain that we can make some pretty big strides by getting the right principles and the right protocols in place to allow the players to develop.
All right, so let's get stuck into it. Your official role is National Teams Director. What are you in charge of?
I think pretty much, the best way to work, I'm in charge of everything really. It's got to do with the national teams. Surrounded by a good management team at the SRU, but I'll be looking after the women's women's rugby, the under-19s, and the men's senior team as well. What we're looking for though is to sort of grow the depth of talent that we have in terms of coaches and their understanding, to allow us to be able to get a group of coaches who can then tap into every age group, or whatever age group we decide, albeit men or the women's, capable to work with those groups. So I don't want to pigeonhole anybody. I want to try and develop the coaches as much as I can with my experience, to open their eyes to maybe a different way of doing things, another approach, and from there we start to build a really challenging environment where the players can grow and develop themselves as well.
What were your first few days like? Because I say that, asking that, because you've played at the top level, you've coached at the top level, coming to Singapore where it's not as progressive as it is in other countries. Did you kind of have to adjust your expectations a little bit?
A lot, yeah. It was. Having been involved with, as I say, when you're working with full-time professional athletes, there are certain things you learn to accept, and the limits on how far you can push them and things like that. And then here I was coming into an environment where people couldn't come to training, people wouldn't come to training, people had work, they had this excuse and that excuse. So these challenges were completely different for me. So whereas I knew exactly how many players would be showing up to any training session I'd run with a professional outfit, these were here in Singapore, I had not a clue. So you could plan a session for 25 players and then only have 14 show up. So you had to be able to adapt, but there's no big issue there if the planning's good. But so there was that. Then there was also, comfort to that was the strength and conditioning levels of the players, which was very weak, a long way off professional level. Players hadn't been exposed to correct training methods or environments. Some of the players have, but there were quite a few that hadn't. And then the skill level, was not very high. So I could see the challenges, and so we set about, trying to. It was all at the first couple of months were learning, listening to people, finding out what's gone on before, and then I had to come up with some sort of formula on how we were going to sort of push things on to progress it. And sadly, COVID, put the brakes on that pretty quickly. Yeah. But we were making some pretty good inroads pre-COVID, and then during the lockdown period, we started to build some very good relationships with the local coaches and with all the club coaches, and trying to develop them, because they ultimately had more contact with the players than I had. So it was trying to get them on board with how I saw rugby, how I understood it, and what I believed would help benefit their players to improve, and ultimately to get the coaches on board with the way we were thinking and wanting to work would lead to better club team performances. So that was it was challenging, but it's been an interesting period there, and we've still got a lot of development work going on and planned with the coaches that will be kicking off during this next period.
So a change that has been implemented since you've been around has been that core group of players. How do they get selected? What do you intend to get out of this core group compared to just the other batch of players who
Sure.
are not involved in that?
Sure. The idea was to try and expose the players and challenge them to an environment, a semi-professional environment, if you like, because the timings with people's work,
Yeah.
study commitments, and I fully respect that. So we had to work around that. So we'd be asking, I was looking, right, strength and conditioning, priority number one. Let's get them lifting some serious weights, very well supervised with a well-balanced program. And, there is Henry Terblanche, South African, who does a bit of work with SCC Academy, strength and conditioning coach out here. And he's had a lot of rugby experience. So he was the ideal guy to be able to head that program up, previously having worked with the men's sevens team with the Singapore Union. And so he's done a very good job of trying to expose them to the demands of, to make those gains physically that we'll see then transform into the field into better performances, allowing the players to be more explosive, stronger, and more confident in what is a contact sport. So it's very important we have those capacity, to be capable to perform. So we put in place 3 mornings a week and early starts. We were looking at 6:30 starts, 6:30 to 8:30, and we'd balance that with skill work at the same time. So the take-up was slow, but the times are hardly sociable either.
Yeah.
So it's a big ask for amateur athletes to commit to it. I have to say the uptake from the women rugby players was outstanding, and their attitude is they were exemplary in everything they did. The men were a little bit slow off the mark, but towards the end of it, before we went into circuit breaker, we were starting to get good numbers, and I think we were starting to get some very good buy-in because players could see their progression. And I think we had minimum after 6 weeks, we had a 10 to 15% improvement across the board in terms of their strength. So that was a real positive. Then on the skill side of it, I want to develop the players just to be able to catch and pass. And while it sounds a little bit flippant, catch and pass is the basic of what we do, run, catch, pass, tackle. And we weren't good. And so we were able to identify, work with the players, try to get them at least 3 times a week along to extra skill sessions, where we'd be looking to try and touch the ball between maybe 500 and 1,000 times a week, so that we can start to really get some high repetition numbers to improve their catch and pass. Before we even talk about how we're going to play the game, I wanted to make sure our fundamentals were sound. So therein lies the idea, and it was men and women mixed, and that was really interesting for me. Because we're practicing exactly the same skills. We weren't doing any contact work. I just let them do that with their clubs. This was a program run alongside the club trainings at that time. So it was, as I say, it was alarming at the start from my perspective of where I've come from, where the levels are at. But I've got to say the progression was great, and it took an awful lot of satisfaction out of the work we'd done then. And unfortunately, the brakes have been put on completely on that. But we're trying to get back up and get things moving along again now.
Yeah, you almost have to start from zero once things get back to normal. But you talk about the progression in that core group at from the beginning to when it stopped. But in the first few days, did you see from the players who've never actually trained that kind of way before, like, oh, what's going on here?
Yeah, there was always, and it was to try to, we wanted to bring in, all aspects of what I'd like to do is provide the environment that a professional rugby player is exposed to. So let's talk about eating properly, let's get our nutrition right, let's talk about recovering properly, let's talk about having adequate medical, good medical systems in place, so that should a player require that, we can train around injuries and getting all these things. Now, for me, coming from the professional background, they were all no-brainers. They were all the ones that were done. We were all very well organised, but here we had to try and develop that as we've been going along. And as I say, the support we've been offered by the guys at the SRU has been great, because I have asked a lot of them to try and source certain things and do things maybe not that they've been done the same way in the past, but we're just trying to bring that all together. And in an amateur environment, it is challenging, but as I maintain, I wanted us to be professional in our attitude, and that's the big key, the big change that we're still working on.
You spoke about getting the fundamentals right say there was no lockdown, there was no COVID, how competitive would the team have been in competitions through improving during that period?
Well, I think the want was there from the players to improve. Post-SEA Games, there was a lot of disappointment around, and you know that's and I understand that disappointment, but at the same time, it was about no, we've got to move on. Okay, so we've got to see why we failed, and I think it was obvious to me, having observed from a distance what was going on. So I was positive that with the coaching staff I'd had around me, that we could have made some pretty good strides in what we were doing. The attitude seemed very good, and I think it's very difficult to judge because we had no trainings as a 15-a-side or anything like that. But I felt confident in my ability to be able to put in place a system with good coaches that the players would be able to put into practice out on the field. So that challenge is still the same going forward now, and that's one I'm still looking forward to.
How did you keep training interesting and keep the players motivated during circuit breaker?
Well, it's all going to come down to the individual, and because it was such a difficult time, I'm very aware of the mental health issues and things like that for everybody during this period. We didn't want to be putting on layers of extra pressure on the players. You've got to be doing this, you have to be doing that. And even post-circuit breaker, I felt it was so important that the players connected again with their families and with their friends, and were able to get back to a semblance of normality. So we wanted to let that ride out really comfortably, because I think it was extremely challenging for everybody. Everybody's circumstances were different, and that had to be taken into consideration as well. But now we've had the green light to go back to training in small groups and things. We've decided to go very slowly on that one as well, because while the training in small groups is effective, and but there's a lot of logistical work that's got to go into it to make it really worthwhile for everybody. And unfortunately, haven't been helped with the Singapore weather of late, so we've been rained out a couple of sessions. But I'm just keen to get back and see the players with the ball in their hands and enjoying themselves, which is ultimately why we play the game.
We've been talking about your involvement with the players, but you're also helping out the coaches. So how have you been helping them improve their own game?
Well, I'm trying to open their eyes to another way of looking at rugby. And so to do that, it was, if we talk about the professionalism side of it, I want them, and how they coach, I want them to see what's going on at the top level. So we spent a lot of time going over old trainings of videos and images, so just showing them what could be done. And my idea, and I'd like, is this use of the technology today of having trainings filmed, 2 or 3 cameras is great, and then reviewing your training session and then sharing that with online platforms such as Huddle, which allows the coach, particularly at distance, to be in contact with the players. And I thought this is something during this lockdown period, that this type of platform is definitely the way forward for us in Singapore with our coaching. Yeah. We don't have that luxury of having the players to sit down in the classroom with us for half an hour before training. Our time's limited, our contact time with the players limited, so we've got to become very, very good at getting the images right, filming trainings, getting them cut properly, making sure, and then passing our message on to these platforms where the players can be sitting on the train, they can be watching their training, they can watch what they're doing, and then able to communicate with the coach during the week about their session. And by doing this, slowly, I think getting these images right was a major one for me to allow so firstly with the games, to make sure we were filming with 2 different angles to allow the coaches to learn a lot more. So this opened their eyes a lot more. And the other big message I had for them was, when they watch games, try not to be a supporter. When they're watching games on television, don't watch the ball. Try and learn and understand what's going on around. So it was a case of me explaining a little bit about my path to learning and what I went down, and then seeing how they would react with it. So we had coaches presenting on certain topics, and we'd have access to a lot of great Super Rugby and things like that, or whatever rugby they wanted, and they'd cut the images and then present to the other coaches. So it was a fascinating, really was a great exercise. I think we must have run about 13 to 15 sessions like that. We had some great guest coaches who were involved as well, from all around the world. So it was it was something that we looked forward to putting together. It took a lot of work, but it's something ongoing that we've got to keep on doing to keep developing our local coaches, particularly, who can be a little bit reluctant to come forward. They sort of like to sit at the back of the classroom a little bit. So trying to encourage them to put themselves out there and to challenge them about how they're coaching.
It's good to educate the coaches, and you spoke a little bit about the challenges that you faced. What are some of the biggest quirks that you didn't realize that you would encounter in Singapore?
I think first one was going out to Turf City to watch the first club games, first weekend of club games. I went out there and so where's the changing rooms? So there was just one changing room shared by about 4 teams, and I go, wow. So that one there straight away, that was pretty bizarre for me. From again, we can't compare where I've come from in terms of professional setup, but that there was pretty odd in itself. And then having lightning warnings, call off games and things like that. We had that on the finals day last year, and warnings. So these were things I'd never been exposed to before. I'd had games frozen off and things like that, but never lightning strikes and things. So, every place has got its own challenges. But I think the biggest challenge, though, for me still is how for an athlete how to perform in these tropical conditions, because they're extremely taxing on the athlete, and trying to find the best way to help them, and for me to understand as well what's actually required to perform in what are pretty extreme temperatures.
Yeah, touching on that, so you have the core group that it's almost semi-professional. Are you trying to push, or are you going to push for it to be professionalized in Singapore rugby, at least for the national team?
I think what I'm pushing for is to have a professional attitude. So semi-professional, I'd rather not talk about any of our rugby as, we should have semi-pro players should be paid for what they're doing. My old school upbringing, I guess, is I started rugby when it was amateur, 1990, and then rugby turned pro in 96 when I moved to England to play, and played professionally for about 8 years up in the UK. But my attitude never changed from when I was an amateur. I said I always want to be the very best that I could be. So that's what I'm looking for from the players. So before we start talking about players getting paid to play rugby, show me that you're there with that right attitude. And I think on the back of good performances and good attitudes, players get rewarded eventually. And so that's what we're just trying to bring into the players, into that mindset. Before we start asking, let's start showing what we can do. And I think there's a real want around the Singapore Rugby Union to move the players, to reward the players. But ultimately, the players, the coaches, we're all responsible for bringing that forward. And so to do that, I've got to make sure all of our coaches are aligned on how we're going to get players performing better. But to do that, we've got to make sure we've got all the tools and everything lined up to be able to help them. And so there's a lot falls back onto us as a union, and the coaches involved. But what I am delighted about is with the attitude and the desire to try and push this thing forward.
It's been very, very stop-start for you, 2020. Has there been an enjoyable part being with SRU? You've not had a game yet, but what have you enjoyed so far?
It's been interesting just listening to other people's experiences about rugby. There's more than one way to play this game, and that's I come from my background is in New Zealand, but I learnt a lot from the Europeans, and then you have the Latin French who are even more explosive, in their personalities and how they go, their reactions and how emotional they can be. And then you can have a pragmatic approach to the English. There's all sorts, and the Pacific Islanders bring another flavour to the game as well. So all these lessons and these cultural lessons, I've got to say I have enjoyed it. I've enjoyed my time here. The contact with the players, sadly, to this point, has been very limited. But, like anything in any sport, I think everybody's passionate about it and people want to talk about it. I'm a little bit through the talking of it now after 11 months because that's all we're doing. And as you rightly touch on, I want to get out there, and I want to get out there with the players and really try and help them progress more and help Singapore Rugby get out there and start winning some games.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on Rugby Lives Here. It's been a really insightful chat. Love to see how the plans progress and how we can put Singapore Rugby, if not on the world map, at least on the Asian map, first of all, and see the team progress with you in charge, of course.
Small steps, but thanks very much. Enjoyed it.
Fantastic. This is Simon Mannix, and this is Rugby Lives Here. We will see you next week at 7 p.m.